everybody. I'm Marianne Mohenraj, and I'm here today for the Speculative Literature Foundation, and I'm interviewing Tempest Bradford. Tempest and I have known each other for a very long time at this point, starting, I don't know, maybe 20 years ago, but our first professional engagement, I think, was when she wrote a story, Until Forgiveness Comes, which was published in the magazine I founded, Strange Horizons, although I don't think I was still running it at the time. And it is a totally blew me away story written in the wake of the Twin Towers falling, and it's one that I teach fairly often. So I wanted to ask Tempest to cast her mind back to that story. I know it's been reprinted since that in an anthology about the towers falling, and I'm sorry if you could remind me of the name.
It was In the Shadow of the Towers.
That's right, In the Shadow of the Towers. And so you can find it there, you can find it at Strange Horizons. In the story, you have people who have been through a disaster and who are involved in an act of remembrance, and it's using technology to create holographs. Is that fair? I mean, tell me if I'm describing it right or wrong in any way. And as a result, it's tremendously vivid. And you go through you put us in that moment, and then you ask some very hard questions about who has the right to be there, what kinds of things we want to commemorate, and how. So maybe if you could just talk a little about what led you to write that story and what you were thinking about as you were putting it together.
Sure. So I wrote that story because I was living in New York during 9/11, and like a lot of other people, it took me a very long time to even process that experience. And I was pretty far away from it because where I was living at the time was Inwood in New York, and that's at the very top of Manhattan. And my friends and I often joke that any kind of disaster that happens, the kaiju from I can't remember what it is now, but Cloverfield, the Cloverfield kaiju. The Cloverfield kaiju would never even made it up to Inwood, and we would have plenty of time to escape from all of that because nothing ever comes. But on that day, it felt a lot less I could just escape because I'm I don't know what's happening. So an experience that a lot of New Yorkers had. And after that, even though I was still living in New York, I tried very hard not to pay attention to the commemorations around 9/11, because it's all, it was all too much. I still hadn't dealt with my own, stuff around that. So I just didn't listen to it. But then I want to say maybe 5 or 6 years after, I was well, I think I'm pretty well processed now. So I can listen to, NPR on the 9/11 memorial, and I was wrong. But as I was listening to, I think it was Margot Adler talking about what they were doing at what was still a hole in the ground, and how they would have people come up and they would have them read the names of their loved ones who died, and then there would be a bell strike to indicate this is when the first plane hit, and this is when the second plane hit, and when the first tower left, right? And so they were essentially recreating the day, because they started at whatever time in the morning everything kicked off, and they had people reading the names and ringing the bells. And I was whoa, y'all are doing some really heavy ritual magic here. Do you know what you are about? And I was thinking about how did we even get to this point where this ritual is being played? Because ritual, even though it is a key part of human experience, it isn't always part of sort of mainstream American experience, right? You don't get a lot of rituals going on, but they legit made a ritual. So I started thinking about that, and I started thinking about ways to sort of get into that, the thinking around the rituals around death and how we deal with it, especially when it's a mass death event, and how that might play out if the culture was different, if it was a culture that was even less sort of squeamish than general American culture is about talking about death, because we don't deal with it well, right? And we certainly don't deal with it well when it's mass death. But also thinking about the ways in which New York City has, been the venue for so many moments like that, right? Like I went to NYU. One of our school buildings is on the location of where the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire happened, right? And there was like some at the time, I think this happened maybe in the 20s or 30s, where there was like a major like disaster on the Staten Island Ferry where a bunch of people die, right? And so there's plaques commemorating that. And like, you know, even though the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire happened like early in the 1900s, I want to say, like when I was going to school in the late 90s and early 2000s, there was still a ceremony in front of that building every year on the anniversary. So yeah, I just, you know, wanted to sort of process my feelings around the way we ritualize remembrance of especially mass death, and how that can be like detrimental and comforting at the same time, but for different people. And you know, how when we ritualize mass death in that way, it also can continue to like make it so that nobody can move on from their feelings about that. And so you can't move on into any kind of process of dealing with, you know, the issues that led to those people committing those crimes, as well as like not conflating the people who commit those crimes with like everyone from their culture, and how that becomes harder and harder the more time we spend like wrapped up in like the same, you know, rituals and reopening of wounds. So that's basically what, you know, I wanted to talk about around all that. And then because an NPR piece had inspired it, I wrote it like an NPR piece.
Oh, that's really interesting. Okay, I've got two questions, follow-up questions. I want to talk about technology, and I also want to talk about, I think maybe I'll start with my second question, which is about sort of when it's valuable to ritualize something like this, and when or even to just put so much effort into remembrance, and when it can lead to, I think you've already gestured to this, it can lead to damage. It can lead to clinging so hard to the past that we reinscribe these wounds over and over, and it gets in the way of healing. I don't know if you want to add something to that. I'm thinking about, well, let me put that in, and I'll lead into my technology question too. So I found that I think your use of holography here probably really influenced a story of mine. I have a story, That She Might Fly, that was published a few years ago, and in it there's a father who's lost a daughter, and he had, you know, taken holographs of her while she was alive, and he sets them up all over his house. And so as you walk from room to room, she's there, and she's laughing, and she's at different ages. So someone comes into the house, and at first they think it's full of little girls, and then slowly she realizes what's actually going on. And he has to be evacuated because there's a disaster coming, and he can't bear to leave this, right? So I think that was influenced by your story. Also, I think by, I went to, I'm going to blank on the name, I had it a second ago, the prison right outside Alcatraz. I went to Alcatraz, and I didn't really expect very much from going there, but they had set up audio recordings of people who had been there, and they, I actually don't know now whether it was the actual people, it was probably actors, but as you walked past the cells, they kind of faded in and out, so you could hear the people talking. It was tremendously ghost-like. It was very unnerving, and at one point it made me want to cry, because there was one man who was talking about how, you know, many nights when you're in Alcatraz, the sound of people partying in the city across the water, it would just carry over the water.
Oh no.
And, you know, and so it was incredibly effective. I thought it was a really, and that was just audio recordings. So maybe if you could talk a little bit about sort of how you were imagining technology affecting this whole process, right?
So technically it is a magical process, but I also wrote it in such a way that you could read it any way, because you know, the whole point was what these people like felt that they were invoking. And so, you know, a lot of people are invoking their dead relative as a way to see them again, even though their dead relative is not actually interacting with them. Like the thing that's left behind. And I based
That's right. It's more ghost-like or magical,
But the thing is, like, so in ancient Egypt, there's 5 parts to the soul. And like the parts that most people know are the Ba and the Ka, because they get written about the most. And the Ba is sort of like your personal soul that goes from person to person as you reincarnate. And the Ka is sort of the spark of life that everyone gets from the creator. And then I forget what some of the other ones are, but then there's the Shayut, and that's the shadow. And so it is like, it's not really a person. It doesn't have like the consciousness of the person, whatever. It's just like a shadow of what they were. And so I, in reading some of the various ancient Egyptian texts, I came up with, you know, the thinking that if you were going to invoke the shadow in the place where they died, it would be like those few moments before death, but you couldn't like talk to them. You couldn't say, you know, anything. You couldn't say I'm sorry and have them like react to you. And that's what I wanted for that. Like not even ghosts that came back and like interacted with you, but ghosts that just like existed. And so, you know, I wrote various people dealing with those ghosts in different ways. Some of them were like, you know, I came and I said goodbye and that was it. And then eventually that shadow will disappear if nobody calls them up, you know, if their family member is not there to call them up. And it's like, you know, sort of it's about letting go, right? It's like they're a metaphor for like how they've let go because they no longer are there to invoke this shadow, right? But then there are some people in the world who think that they're not just invoking the shadow, that they're like literally pulling these people from the afterlife for this ritual, which then puts them right back where they were when they died. And they're like, that's not good for them. They need to be doing, you know, they need to let these people go and such. And yeah, that was another thing, because like that's what I feel like a lot of this is like people like really holding on, you know, to their loved ones, which I 100% understand. There's another story I wrote. It's called Elan Vital, and it was recently reprinted in Black sci-fi short stories. And it was originally in Sybil's Garage. And it's the one where I deal with my mother's death. And it's based on a dream that I had, that I continue to have a lot, where my mother died when I was 20 years old, and she died from cancer. And so oftentimes when I dream about her, in the dream, I'll say something like, oh, how much time do we have left? She's like, oh, I have about a week, or, oh, it's just today, or whatever. And when I finally started to realize after years and years of having this dream is, like, somehow in my brain was saying that, like, I brought your mother back, but I can only back her up from death for a certain amount of time. And that's why you keep asking about the time, because, like, there's a time limit for how long she can be with you, because then she's going to die. Like, she's always going to die. And so from that, I wrote this story about a woman who literally brings her mother back to life through a technological process, where she gives up some of her life force, life energy to her mother in order for her mother to be able to come back to life. So she's like sort of kept in this, like, this stasis in the moment before death, and then she's given a little bit more life to come back. And sometimes it's for a couple of hours, sometimes it's as long as a day, but like however long it is, it's taking that off of the person's life, right? So and so in the story, you know, the mother and daughter finally have the conversation about like how like letting go needs to happen, because the daughter is doing it too much. Like, she's giving up too much of her life force and taking years off of her life to spend more time with her mother, who she loves and doesn't want to let go of. And the mother at first is like, I agreed to do this because I felt guilty for leaving you, but like, you've been doing this too much and you're not having your own life. And you have to make the decision to let me go. And so, yeah, like I feel like a lot of my early stories were about like those kinds of things, like the ways that people want to like cling to the people that they lost, especially if they lost them in like a terrible way, a sudden way, you know, whatever it is, and like how, like what they might do to bring them back. And I remember when that story got published on Escape Pod, that there were some people who were in the forums who were talking about it, and they were like, I don't understand. Excuse me. They were like, I don't understand why somebody would like go to all this trouble, blah, 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 for that. And there were other people who were like, you have not lost a beloved loved one. You have never had like a real big loss, sudden loss in your life, because if you did, you would understand. Mm-hmm. And I feel like that right there is like, that was the most sort of satisfying, you know, comment I could have, is that other people who understood that grief, understood the story that I was trying to write. And if it didn't connect with the people who hadn't understood that grief, that's completely understandable, because like they haven't had that kind of loss. And of course, obviously I don't wish that kind of loss on everybody, right. but like that, it's going to happen eventually. If you love somebody, right. You're going to lose them. And so, yeah, I think about that a lot, just because I had that huge loss, like right in the beginning of my adulthood. Mm-hmm. And it's pretty much affected everything I've done ever since.
I think that's super interesting thematically, but I also think that, you know, to some extent you're using text, some extent you're using magic, as these vehicles for making these emotions manifest. And now I kind of want to do a side-by-side reading of like Elan Vital and something like Nala Hopkins and her Ganger Ball Lightning, or the story about the Sukiyant. I'm blanking on the title, but from Skin Folk, because I feel like she's working with similar themes, and it would be interesting to see the similarities, but also the differences in how you handle these issues. So, okay, I'm going to transition now. So, so you've published a whole bunch of short fiction. I think, am I right that you're working on a novel? So tell me if not. And,
yes.
Yes. Okay, good. Okay. Okay, good. You're working on a novel, because my recollection is I've read some of this, and it's, you were traveling to Egypt and doing research. And so maybe if you could talk a little bit, at the SLF, we have a travel grant that we encourage everyone to apply for. It's free to apply. It's $1,000 grant if you get it. But maybe if you can talk a little about, you know, how has your travel research gone? What led you to work perhaps in that area? Just sort of giving people a general sense of, what it's been like, what the process has been.
Cool. So this novel is a steampunk novel set in ancient Egypt. I'm still writing it. I feel like I'll be writing it forever. But it's actually, this is the novel that has been teaching me like a lot of things about my process. So I guess I can't be like too mad that I'm still working on it. Right. But yes, I did feel like I needed to go to Egypt in order to like do well by this novel and any like subsequent ones I work on in this world. Because I also really like my world. And I knew that because when I was in college, we went to England for like a 3-week class. And one of the things that we got to do was we got special access to Stonehenge. So we actually got to walk into Stonehenge and not just stand by the fence and like touch it. And it was amazing. And I remember that moment of standing next to the stones and being like, I have seen pictures of Stonehenge all my life, but I have never gotten the scope of just how giant these stones are. And this is why it's so impressive that, you know, people, however long ago this was built, that people drag these stones from so far away and then put them together like this. Right. They're huge, right? And I was like, this is awesome. So yeah, even though like I've seen plenty of pictures of things in Egypt, like during my research, and you know, I've seen layouts of temples and writings on the wall and whatever, I knew that like I really needed to go to Egypt. And so I went the first time in 2017, and it was an amazing trip, and yeah, it gave me exactly what I needed. It gave me the real like scope of things, and just like standing next to a column that's 3 times bigger around than you are, and just how much like the iconography and stuff is always just like right there for people to see. Like I've had to suss out a lot of nonsense in some of the research that I've done, because there's a lot of nonsense in Egyptology. There just is, because of just like the way that the discipline has, you know, evolved. But like one of the things that always made me go like, I don't know if I trust that, is they would say things like, well, you know, only 10% of the population was literate. And I'm like, that can't be true, because why is there all this writing on the wall? Like they may not have been able to be as literate as a scribe, you know, and maybe they only knew how to read traditional hieroglyphs and not hieratic, which are, you know, different enough that I could see it being, you know, difficult. But like I don't believe that like people in ancient Egypt were just like staring at like the iconography and the hieroglyphs on the wall and just being like, well, I don't know what that means, but I guess we're supposed to go in here and do something. Like, you know, I've been to Egypt twice now and I can read some hieroglyphics, like not a whole lot,
right.
but like I have done enough looking at it and remembering like when people said this means that and this means that I can read some more of the symbolism. And I'm like, there's no way that people who like literally lived here don't understand that. And that was something that I could really only like wrap my mind around when seeing just like how much of it is everywhere and how much is like, you know, on the insides of the temples versus the outside of the temple, because like some parts of the temple weren't for everybody, right? And let me tell you, like you can't get a scope of the pyramids without standing next to some freaking pyramids. And that was kind of the best thing of all. I also like have a great appreciation for whoever built them, because I walked all the way up into the middle of the pyramid and whoo, that was hard. Yeah. but yeah, like that is why like, you know, travel grants and stuff like that are so important, because yeah, like sometimes you really do need to be in a place in order to like just stand there and see like, what does that look like in the distance? You know, what does this look like when I'm standing right next to it, in order to be able to convey that, because the conveying of that can be so key. Like it's really key for my characters because they're interacting with all of these different places. And so, yeah, like that, I knew that I needed to do it, and it was like even better than I imagined. So
I had a similar experience when I went to Sri Lanka to do some research, and I had known, I'd read history books. I'd known that Sri Lanka had been a multi-ethnic, multi-religious society for 2,000 years, right? But there's been so much recent conflict centered around some of these issues that it's hard to feel the truth of that, right? It had been a pretty harmonious multi-ethnic society for a lot of that time. But when you walk into these giant Buddhist temples, and they're beautiful, they're very peaceful, you have often a white Buddha carving, it's all very spare and Spartan, and then you walk into the same building, just over to the side a little bit is the Hindu temple, and it is an explosion of color and gods and goddesses, right? And you have to think, they must have gotten along pretty well if they would go to all this effort to build these two temples in the same building, and people would be going to, you know, worshiping at whichever one they chose, and then probably eating together afterwards, right? So it really brought home the reality to me in a way that I don't think I had gotten from the books beforehand. So I'm really looking forward. The early draft I think I read from your novel, I was totally enraptured by these clockwork figures you were using, and the way the spirits were moving through the book I hope that's all there still.
Yeah, it's totally there.
Okay, because I love that. But that was all before you went to Egypt, so I'm sure it's even more fabulous now. And it's just, I'm not going to tell you finish it, because I'm also working on a novel, and I know sometimes it takes a while. Novels are hard to predict, but whenever it finishes, I look forward to reading it. Yay. So I want to talk about the book that you do have coming out. So you've done a lot of different kinds of writing. You've done short fiction, nonfiction, you've written for NPR, game writing, but you have a middle grade book coming out. So that is super exciting to me. It is coming out in September 2022, and it's called Ruby Finley versus the Interstellar Invasion. And I've read a few blurbs, but I haven't read the book. So why don't you just tell us about it? What do you want us to know?
This book came out of nowhere for me. I was not planning on writing a middle grade book. It just like stomped into my head and was like, write me. And so I finally listened. But basically it's about a little black girl, and she's a genius. She's 11, and she wants to be an entomologist. Like she just loves bugs and insects and all the creepy crawly things. And so one day she's in her front yard, she sees the weirdest bug ever. So of course she scoops it up, puts it in a mason jar, takes it inside, as you do with all the weird bugs that you find. Just take them inside. And she's trying to figure out like what it is. She's consulting all her books and the internet, and she can't find it. And so she takes a picture of it, she puts it on Twitter. And she's not supposed to have a Twitter account.
No.
She puts it on Twitter, and she's like asking other people on bug Twitter, like, have you ever seen something that looks like this? And then as soon as she's done doing that, she looks back at the mason jar and she's like, where's the bug? It's gone. And then she's like, why is there a hole? And then she looks over at the window and she's like, there it is at the window, and it's burning through my window screen and escaping. And then she's like, what is happening? So she runs outside, but she can't find it. And so she's sitting there trying to figure out like how she's going to explain the hole in the window screen. 5 black cars roll up to her house, and men in black suits step out of them, and they're like, where's this thing that you put on Twitter? And she's like, I don't know, it escaped. And her grandmother's like, she's not supposed to be on Twitter. Where is this bug? Why is this bug getting out of my house? What is going on? And so yeah, it's like it begins the adventure of like why it is that like these men in black suits came looking for this weird bug that Ruby can't identify. So that's what it's about.
And she's going to save the day, I hope.
She will totally save the day.
Yes. Yay!
Will be no saving the day without Ruby.
That is really awesome. I am really looking forward to reading it. And I think there's just been a terrific explosion of fabulous middle grade recently. And so I'm glad to see your book joining the mix. Ruby Finley versus the Interstellar Invasion, September 2022. And so we're going to start wrapping up this, but Tempest also teaches writing classes and has for quite a long time. So she teaches them in person, she teaches them online, she can be hired to teach writing classes. And so some of her classes that are coming up are on our website, which is ktempestbradford.com. But we were gonna ask her if she could give us just a little taste of something that you like to teach, something you like to talk about.
So as far as writing the other goes, I have so many things that that I love to talk about. I'm just like, read 100 books, do it. But there are like 2 aspects of writing craft that lately I have begun to discover that not a lot of people are being like taught or exposed to, even though they're like not new ideas. Or maybe like they have like really bad sort of feelings about them. And one of them is writing exercises, which you say writing exercises and some people are like, I'm out, peace out, running for the hills, like I'm not doing this crap, right? And then, and the other thing is like structure, like taking a really hard look at structure, because sometimes it's like also depending on how you were taught, but like some writers are, I guess, sort of taught to mistrust structure because it takes the creativity out of things. But
well, I think people also like misunderstand a little bit, like in just from the MFA program point of view, people talk a lot about things evolving organically, but that doesn't mean it doesn't have to have a structure that works.
Right, exactly. Exactly. And yeah, we get a lot of students who like say like, oh, I hadn't thought about doing this kind of background work because I'd been told that like everything should come out organically. And I'm like, it's still organic though, because you still have to make it up. So like one of the writing exercises that we give the students in our Creating Diverse Characters class and some of our other classes. And also we ran a NaNoWriMo prep course last year using some of these exercises. And they're all about character background. And so the first one is like, the character relationship background one is you pick a relationship that's key to the character's life. That could be a really good friend, a mentor, a family member, a found family member, you know, whatever it is. And then you, there's like different questions that you ask, like, what was the beginning of this relationship? What is the first point of real risk in the relationship? What is a day that like a character would describe as their best day ever with that person? And then what is the end of that relationship? And I will say that like I got this one from Stant Latore, who writes fabulous writing books that you should definitely check out. So you take that and then you pick, you know, say one of those scenes and you write out the scene. And then after you've written out the scene, like from the perspective of like your character that you're focusing on, then write the scene from the other person's point of view, that same scene. And not only does this allow you to get into more of like the background of the character, what they're doing, but it allows you to like really make that relationship between that other person real if it hasn't quite happened on the page yet. Like maybe that person is out of their life by the time like your work in progress starts. Or maybe like you don't know the beginning of the relationship, they're still in it, like they're still friends or they're still married or whatever it is. But like in exploring like what was that first meeting like? you get to know a little bit more about them. The other background exercises we have students do is to basically like answer the questions of like, what is your character's greatest fear? What is your character's greatest desire? And there's usually some event in their life that has engendered those things, right? So writing about that event, like what has made them have this great fear? What has made them have this great desire? Sometimes they're the same event, you know, very often they will be. And so we will have the students like identify that, like identify the greatest fear and the greatest desire, and then write those scenes of like how those came about. And again, this is something that maybe you will have thought about as a writer, like that they have this desire or whatever, but you haven't like deeply explored where it came from. And so actually sitting there and exploring where it came from, again, helps you to get to know your character better. Sometimes you reveal things to yourself that you didn't know consciously, and it's still organic because like you are just making that up in the moment. But whatever it is that comes out of that is going to help you understand that character better in the work in progress as you go forward. Because I'm very suspicious of the idea that like you have to get to know your character over the course of them going through their greatest change or whatever, right? It's like maybe know them a little bit before that, right, so that you can really imbue them with like who they are, where they start, because that's hopefully going to be different depending on the type of story you're writing at the end of the thing.
I love that. I think to go back to maybe the first thing you were talking about, it reminds me a little of how that kind of exercise can also be helpful when you have written sort of cardboard characters. So I had one story where I had a villain, and he was just a villain, and he was not very interesting, and he didn't make a lot of sense, and I ended up realizing that, thankfully, and going in and I wrote a scene from his point of view from earlier in his life, and it just crystallized everything. It you know, I was like, oh, that's why he's acting the way he's acting, and it totally makes sense from his point of view, and no wonder he's being such a jerk here. And then when I came back to the story, I was able to write him more coherently, in a way that made more sense. So yeah, I think, you know, I feel like also writing exercises can be like, sometimes when you're new to them, it can feel like there's a lot of weight, like, oh, this is going to be a big thing. But I think of it like sometimes like running scales on the piano before you start working on a piece. You know, it's 5 minutes, it's 10 minutes, it's a little like jump start to get the writing muscles going too. So
exactly,
don't be scared, people.
Yeah. And like literally every other artistic discipline has this, right? Like, yeah, when you are learning an instrument, you do a lot of playing scales and a lot of playing really simple songs before you start with something complicated. You're doing a lot of practice when you're a dancer. You're doing a lot of sketching that no one's ever going to see when you're an artist. Like, there's all these things, but like writing is the one where like practice of that kind is like very undervalued, and sometimes devalued, because they're like, no, you got to work on that work in progress. But like, no words are ever wasted, and that's the other thing that I hear from a lot of students, that they fear that it's like, oh, I wrote all these words, but it's not like I can use them. It's like, well, but you are using them because you, in the act of writing, you have learned more about writing. So even though it's not going in your work in progress, it doesn't matter. It's all contributing to your skill set and the bettering of your skills.
And I feel like that may be something where we've fail students a little bit with the sort of science fiction fantasy workshop model, because that tends to be very story focused and very like getting to a completed story, getting it published. And one thing I do really appreciate about my very early writing classes in college and my MFA was I had teachers who talked about morning pages, or who talked about just keeping the pen moving on the page, and just built in all of these kinds of exercises. I really like Natalie Goldberg's Writing Down the Bones, which is just full of pages of exercises like this. So, all right, well, I've kept you for more than half an hour trying to not exhaust all my writers, and Tempest and I are at ICFA. We are at the very tail end of a long conference, and we're finishing it off. So we're, I think, going to go probably poolside and get a drink next. But I will leave you with the note that the classes that she teaches, the Writing the Other classes she teaches jointly with Nisi Shawl, who is also a fabulous writer. Nisi Shawl's Everfair, everybody should go read immediately if you have not yet. It's incredible. And So I'm not sure quite when this will air. The next class they have scheduled is for April 9th to 23, so this may not be airing before that. Dialogue, dialect, and narrative voice, which I'm sure will be amazing. But there are more after that and more future. So again, website, ktempestbradford.com. Tempest, is there anything else you want to leave people with?
Just write. Write exercises, write. That's it.
Excellent. Thank you so much. This was great.
Thank you for having me.